Again, welcome to everybody. My name's Jeremy Deer. I'm the International Federation of Journalists Deputy General Secretary. And thank you to the NUJ for the opportunity here to shine a spotlight on some of the countries where journalism is under fire, and on some of the issues which pose huge challenges to journalism's ability to fulfill its crucial mission. It's also an opportunity for us to pay tribute to those journalists on the front lines of standing up for media freedom. And we're joined in particular by speakers from Ukraine and Yemen, two countries where war has caused such a serious toll on journalists and journalism. We will have 3 or 4 speakers today. There is still one trying to get through the technical issues to join us. Each of them will have around 7 or 8 minutes so that we leave some time for questions and comments that people may wish to make. If people want to use the chat or the Q&A to put questions in, then I will try to monitor that and ask them of the relevant person. None of us can have felt anything but shock at some of the images and stories coming from Ukraine over the past few weeks following the Russian invasion of that country. And it shows how much we rely on frontline journalists to be able to help uncover the truth and tell the story of what is going on in a war and in a conflict situation. Lena Kush is a Ukrainian journalist with more than 25 years experience, worked with people like Reuters, the BBC, and as head of regional correspondence in the all-Ukrainian newspaper. She's also, more importantly for us, first secretary of the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine, where she coordinates the work of the union's 24 regional offices. Lena, you're very welcome, and please, the floor is yours to tell us about not only the terrible toll on journalism, but also the excellent work that you and your colleagues are doing.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeremy, dear colleagues, dear friends. Thank you for inviting me for this event. I find it difficult to believe that today we are discussing the war in Ukraine, a war in Europe, and a war in the 21st century. And nevertheless, I would like to talk about journalist solidarity, which has become a force in these difficult days. Thank you for supporting us. We see it's inspiring. From the very first days of the Russia invasion, our colleagues covered this situation in detail and risked their lives under fire. You were among the first to call for contribution to the EFG Safety Fund for journalists in Ukraine. This made it possible to cover personal protective equipment and first aid kits for Ukrainian journalists. Moreover, you helped to evacuate hundreds of local journalists from the war zone. Your participation in solidarity action for Ukraine strengthens public pressure and encourages government to make decisions that will stop the aggressor. The National Union of Journalists of Ukraine has been working for in emergency mode for about 3 months. I am sitting in the Journalist Solidarity Center in Chernivtsi. We opened the hotline for journalists, including Ukrainian and foreign journalists, and we launched it last month 3 centers of for journalists, for displaced journalists, and for journalists in war zones. There are premises and where journalists can work, hold trainings or meetings or online broadcasts. And it's a full-fledged co-working place, and but the work of the centers is aimed and help journalists all over Ukraine. For example, we receive and hand over protective gear and first aid kits for journalists like this IFAC, for example. We help editorial offices to receive laptops, video, photo cameras, or other equipment for their work. We are in contact with evacuated journalists, helping with accommodation and other needs. More than 150 evacuated journalists get emergency financial assistance, and this is one of the uses the International and European Federation of Journalists Fund. What does the media field look like now? The first trend is a sharp increase in audience, demand for quality sources of information, and the professional media are such sources. At the same time, Ukrainian journalists, most of Ukrainian journalists, especially local journalists, had a lack of experience in covering war zone or in covering the war. Therefore, there was a great need to protect and train journalists. We developed and shared safety guidelines, for example, like this, and conducted online trainings for and online consultation. Half of the participants, for example, during this training were listening us from bomb shelters, sitting in the bomb shelters. We estimate that since the Russia invasion, up to 3,000 Ukrainian media workers were left homeless. It's about 1 in 10 journalists. There is the second challenge. We helped with the evacuation, but we didn't expect its scale and complexity. For example, some journalists from Mariupol walked up to 5 or 7 miles to left the dangerous zone to get out from the shelling zone. And after that, they have to pass about 15 Russia checkpoints, risking being arrested or killed. Journalists from the occupied regions had a difficult journey because the only way to left the occupied territories is the way through Russia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland to Ukraine. The third challenge is the destruction of all economic models of independent media in Ukraine. 90% of journalists we surveyed talked about a loss of advertisers. 2 editorial offices out of 3 have lost the possibility to earn money by selling print media or selling airtime, etc. Every 4th journalist work without pay, and the other, at least the rest of editorial offices have cut their salaries as usual. According to the survey conducted by National Union of Journalists of Ukraine, at least 1 in 5 media lost access to their building, to their rooms and their equipment because of combat, because of hostilities or occupation. Up to 5% of news outlets said us that their buildings were destroyed or they have lack of electricity and communication. A large proportion of displaced journalists need to resume work in a new location. The next problem is the information cleansing carried out by the Russia in the territories they have seized or they have temporarily controlled. Armed Russian soldiers come to the homes to local journalists and demand they to work supporting the Russia regime. Journalists were arrested or their relatives were arrested. We have recorded at least 10 such cases in Ukraine. Or they simply, Russia representatives simply take over the editorial office and the brand and start printing the newspaper, for example. Our colleagues continue to cover events in the occupied territories, but this work is with big risk, and they risk their freedom and their lives. The last problem is the influence of destructive Russia propaganda, which seeks to hide the truth about Russia war crimes in Ukraine. We see a danger in the fact that as a certain war news fatigue grows, audiences in Britain and elsewhere may be influenced by Russia propaganda. So the question, how can you help Ukrainian journalists today? My answer is this: please continue to tell the truth about the war in Ukraine. If you need assistance in organizing trip or interview, contact our hotline. We can also share the stories of journalists working in Ukraine today. Please encourage your audience to contribute to the safety fund for journalists in Ukraine, or otherwise support Ukrainian journalists. We have more than 200 profiles of evacuated journalists and editorial offices in our database, as well as journalists who continue to work in the occupied territories and can provide you such information for supporting specific media or specific journalists if you would like. Please continue to expose Russia propaganda and its destructive influence on international audiences. Monitor compliance with sanctions and find the assets of Russian media personalities under sanction. Your support brings Ukraine closer to victory and the restoration of a peaceful life. I believe in the power of our corporate solidarity to help us achieve a major victory, the victory of trust and freedom. On behalf of the Ukrainian journalists, I thank you for your strength and for your faith with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena, and thank you to you and all your colleagues for the work that you're doing day in, day out to not only try to keep your members safe, but also to help provide support to international journalists who are arriving in Ukraine. And thank you also to NUJ members for the donations that they have once again made to an IFJ Solidarity Fund. The NUJ was at the forefront of raising funds after the Afghanistan crisis, and in terms of individual donations to the IFJ's Special Ukraine Safety Fund, once again, you've shown that international solidarity is not just a word you talk about, it's something very practical and heartfelt and built into the DNA of the IFJ. And that has helped us, as Lena said, to be able to help them set up the solidarity centers, provide safety equipment and so on. So it is really vital, and I see that Michelle has put the link to the special fund into the chat there if anyone still wishes to donate. And if the war in Ukraine is in the headlines every day, the war in Yemen is often called the silent war, not least because in our Western media, it receives virtually no coverage, and yet it is no less devastating for journalists and journalism than other wars raging around the world, including the fact that we have 4 journalists currently on death row in Yemen. So I'd like to welcome Sami Al-Ansi, who is a Yemeni journalist currently based in Sweden, has worked for AFP, for Sky News Arabia, as a video journalist and producer in Yemen, and then was forced to leave in 2015 and currently works as a video reporter for the Swedish public broadcaster SBT. Sami, you're very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. And in order to save time, I would start talking about what's happening in Yemen and what has been going on in Yemen since the start of the war. Since the beginning of the war in Yemen in 2015 until now, the press freedom has been subjected to systematic violence. Nearly 1,450 cases of violations of press freedoms have been recorded by the Yemeni syndicates, journalist syndicates, and like starting with murder, attempt of murder, kidnapping, property seizing, blocking websites, closing newspapers, raiding and shutting down radio stations, and cutting off the salaries of the journalists. During the war, more than 300 journalists were kidnapped and being imprisoned for different periods of time, which can last to several years by both warring parties, the Houthis and the internationally recognized government. But most of the kidnappings were carried out by the Houthi militias. There are more than 200 websites were blocked by the Houthis, as they control the Ministry of Communication and the internet service in Yemen. We have like more than 100 attempts of murders for journalists during the period of from 2015 to this year. So far, we have recorded, according to the statistics, we have 44 journalists who have been killed during the war in Yemen. Some of them have been killed by direct shooting by snipers in front of the cameras, like Khalid al-Shaybani, who has been working as cameraman in Taiz, and also Muhammad al-Yemeni, the freelance journalist who has been working in Taiz also. Some of them were killed by landmines. Others were placed as human shields in sites exposed to airstrikes, such as the journalist Abdullah Qabil and Yusuf al-Aizari, who have been killed in Damar city. There are also those who were killed in a suicide car bombing, and the list goes on. In general, the Yemeni journalists are being targeted by all sides. The Houthi have assaulted, detained, and threatened journalists in the areas that are under their control, and they killed several journalists with mortar and like missile fires. As well as the Yemeni government has also harassed and detained journalists. Let me focus on or talk about the 4 Yemeni journalists who have been detained by the Houthis in Sana'a since 2015 and are now on the death row after being condemned for their work as journalists. And through you, I call on the global journalism community to put pressure on the Houthi authorities to release our colleagues and save their lives. We have Abdul Khaliq Amran, Tawfiq Al-Mansouri, Harith Hamid, and Akram Al-Walidi, who were arrested together with 5 other journalists on June 9, 2015 in Sana'a. Their arrest was motivated by their reporting on human rights violations committed by Houthi forces. And the Houthi court sentenced those 4 journalists to death. This is not the first death sentence by the Houthi courts, by the way. Before that, a death sentence had been issued against the journalist Yahya Abdulraqib al-Jubayhi, who, on the pretext of spying. And under pressure, we have under pressure, he was released, but the charges were not dropped yet. Back to our 4 journalists, I would like to talk about their health situation. They have a very catastrophic and very difficult health situation. They are not allowed to take medicines or see doctors. Abdul Khaliq Amran has a spinal injury and he is not allowed to see a doctor. Akram al-Walidi also is completely ill and he needs permanent medication, but the militia refuses to give him medicines. They are put in an underground prison, which is not healthy environment at all, and being tortured continuously. The Houthi is also hiding them from their families and transferring them from one prison to another for periods of time that lasts for months, while their families do not know anything about them during the transfer. We have information that the Houthi groups wants to exchange those 4 journalists with leaders belonging to Houthi movements. We have heard the testimonies of the 5 colleagues who were released in prisoner exchange recently, and they told us that the torture that was taking place inside the prisons is indescribable. So I think we demand hearing for them by international journalists, also by the IFG and the human rights organization, to hear their testimonies. Regarding to the journalists who have been forced to leave Yemen, according to our statistics, there are between 700 to 1,000 journalists who have been displaced inside Yemen or outside Yemen in the diaspora. Currently, most of them are currently living in Egypt. The reason behind that is the threats imposed by the warring parties and the killings of the journalists, also the lack of safe working environment and in all region of Yemen. Actually, freedom of speech in Yemen doesn't no longer exist. There are only media outlets and journalists loyal to the warring parties who can only work in Yemen freely during the conflict. I'm an example of those people, of these journalists who have been forced to the country. I have been forced my country in 2015 and moved to Egypt because I couldn't keep working in Yemen because I have received threats to my life, and I have been attacked by armed people, 2 armed men, and I got also my shoulder dislocated after this attack. So I decided to move to work from my exile and keep working about Yemen and on Yemen file. Regarding the Yemeni journalist syndicates, I think we need more international solidarity to keep it steadfast. It has been weakened tremendously, but it is still alive, representing Yemen journalists. The Yemeni Journalist Syndicates is still operating at its limit capacity, despite the difficulties of that they face in Yemen. It has no headquarters in Yemen since the outbreak of the war in 2015. The syndicate is trying to monitor violations that occur to Yemen journalists on a daily basis and to communicate with the world through the IFJ, which plays a golden and major role in helping the Yemeni journalists. The syndicates need also to train Yemeni journalists who are still working on the field in Yemen. Like, we need to give them training courses on hostile environment and first aid, HIFAT, for example, as many of the journalists who were killed because they did not know how to work in the war zones areas, or hostile environments. Perhaps they would have had better luck if they had received some training. Yeah, to sum up, I would like to say that things in Yemen haven't got better yet, and we need the UN, the EU, and all governments across the world to stand up for journalists in Yemen, and telling the Houthi militias that attacking, torturing, and executing journalists is a war crime, and that would, should not be tolerated. They should be tolerated as war criminals. I think I have said what I'm trying to say, because we don't have time to talk about specific and much detail. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Sami. And people will see that I put in the chat the link to the IFJ's campaign on Yemen, and in particular the 4 colleagues on death row. And we've also put up there the open letter that people can sign. And people should also remember that UK and other governments' supply of weapons during that conflict is helping to fuel the war, and there are plenty of campaign groups in the UK and other countries who are campaigning for an end to supplying military assistance to the forces during that war. So please take a look at the campaign page that we have and take action to support our colleagues in Yemen. Probably one of the most shocking images of this week was the scenes at the funeral of Shireen Abu Akleh, when Israeli forces attacked the funeral procession, leading to her coffin being dropped and hitting the ground. And it's to Palestine that will turn now. Jennifer Robinson QC is one of the world's leading human rights lawyers, and she's well known to the IFJ and the NUJ for her work defending BBC Persian service journalists and being part of Julian Assange's legal team. But along with her colleagues, she's representing the IFJ and the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate in the case that we have submitted to the International Criminal Court, detailing the systematic targeting of Palestinian journalists by the Israeli army. And the killing of Shireen was not an isolated incident, it was just the latest in this targeting of Palestinian journalists. So Jen, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Jeremy, and for giving me a promotion. I'm not yet a QC, but I'll take it. It's a pleasure to join you all and to speak together with Lena and Sami. I just want to pay tribute to the work that you and your colleagues are doing in such difficult circumstances. And that's precisely why our team, the International Media Defence team at Dowdy Street Chambers, is so committed and passionate to working on these issues and the protection of journalists, to push back on the targeting of journalists, because your work is so important. I want to address 3 quick things today, and I'll try to be quick because we are running short on time. I just want to say a few words about the targeting of journalists in the context of armed conflict, the long history of the targeting of Palestinian journalists by Israel, and the ICC complaint that we've filed together with the IFJ, to give you some context about the nature of that complaint. But of course, you know, the role of journalists in conflict is absolutely essential. Journalists play a key role in not just showing us the brutality and horror of the conflict and its very serious human consequences, but also that material is essential for us as lawyers in holding governments to account for those crimes and for those human rights abuses. And of course, journalists provide us with important objective accounts of what's happening on the ground to counter government disinformation and propaganda. Now, it's precisely because of that that journalists are so targeted by governments in conflict. Now, that's been thrown to sharp relief with what we've been seeing on the ground in Ukraine, with the targeting of journalists by Russia, the targeting of media infrastructure, and of course, those draconian domestic laws implemented to limit the reporting on the war or even calling it a war at all. And so from our point of view as lawyers, we've been talking about this as a long time. Journalists are protected as civilians in any kind of conflict. And of course, wearing your press vest should be protection. It is a clear sign to government forces that you ought not be targeted. You are not a legitimate target. You are not fair game. Targeting of journalists and the killing of journalists is not just a human rights violation, it is a war crime. And it is, in my view, a war crime in order to cover up other war crimes, because governments know the essential role that you play on the ground in documenting the other war crimes that they're committing. Taking out journalists as a way of giving themselves cover to commit abuse with impunity. And that's why protecting journalists, we say, working with the IFJ, why protecting journalists from being targeted is so essential for the role that you play on the ground, but also the role you play for protecting other civilians, being the front line of pushing back on government violations in conflict. Now, as Jeremy said, this happens in every conflict, and sadly we've seen scenes this week around the killing of Shireen Al-Akleh, which is sadly not an isolated incident. She was shot in the head while wearing a press vest. This is quite clearly unlawful and potentially a war crime. And we certainly hope that this will be properly investigated and taken up. We've already heard calls from the Palestinian Authority that it ought to be taken to the ICC. But this has been going on for a very long time, and the IFJ has been active in condemning the deliberate targeting of journalists by Israel. A UN Independent Commission of Inquiry into the 2018 protests in Palestine found that 39 media workers were injured by live ammunition used by the IDF, 5 by bullet fragments and shrapnel, and 4 by rubber-coated metal bullets. Others have been directly hit by tear gas canisters. Among the cases that were documented by this UN Commission of Inquiry were 2 of our clients, Ahmed Abu Hussein and Yasser Mutaja, who were shot and killed by the IDF while covering the Great March of Return. Now, the UN's Commission of Inquiry itself found that they were killed and maimed while wearing press vests, clearly masked press vests, and that there were reasonable grounds to conclude that the Israeli snipers shot these journalists intentionally, despite seeing that they were marked as press. But this, again, even that is not an isolated incident. At least 46 journalists have been killed since 2000, and no one has been held to account. Now, it was for this reason that the IFJ, we got together with the IFJ to start talking about legal strategies for accountability. And this was back in early 2020 that we first started to devise this legal strategy. At that time, the ICC investigation into Palestine was still in the consideration of the jurisdiction phase. In the meantime, we started our advocacy by raising complaints with the UN Special Rapporteurs at the Human Rights Council, raising concern not just about the deliberate targeting of journalists, the shooting of journalists by IDF snipers, but also the broader context of the systemic discrimination against Palestinian journalists, restrictions on their freedom of movement, difficulties in obtaining accreditation and being able to travel to cover events in the region. We filed that complaint in December 2020, and we are continuing to follow up with the Human Rights Council on that. But as we've seen, in February 2021, the ICC announced that it has jurisdiction over the situation in Gaza, the West Bank and Eastern Jerusalem, the occupied Palestinian territories, which gave us our opportunity. In that time, since we first filed our complaints to the UN, of course, we saw the bombarding of Gaza in 2021, the targeting of the media towers and Palestinian media organizations, also international organizations like Al Jazeera and Associated Press. We gathered together information working with the IFJ and the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate working on the ground to submit a complaint to the ICC, which was filed just last month, dealing with both the targeting of journalists during the Great March of Return in 2018 and these more recent targeting of media infrastructure and journalists in the 2021 bombardment. Our complaint was formally acknowledged by the OPT, the ICC's prosecution office, on the 25th of April, just recently. And the complaint alleges war crimes against journalists by Israel's security forces, which will now be considered by them and could lead to a formal investigation and prosecution. Our complaint deals with the systematic targeting of Palestinian journalists on behalf of 4 named victims: Ahmed Abu Hussein, Yasser Mutaja, Muath Armaneh, and Nedel Eshtayeh, who were all killed or maimed by Israeli snipers while covering those demonstrations. All of them, again, were wearing press vests. A brief word on our next steps. The reason that we've brought this is that the targeting of journalists, we often hear the refrain, journalism is not a crime, but the targeting of journalists is a crime. It is a human rights violation and it's a war crime and it should be prosecuted as such. So now that we've filed our complaint, we'll be doing continuing advocacy together with the IFJ and the PJS to advocate that the prosecutor ought to take up these cases because they are emblematic of a broader pattern of targeting in Palestine, but not just in Palestine, in Ukraine, in Yemen. And that's why these cases are so important, because the ICC has never taken a thematic direct approach to the prosecution of war crimes against journalists. And the problem is that we're seeing it happen more and more around the world. Palestine really is just the beginning, and I think that these accountability efforts ought to be ramped up, and that our work in advocating to the ICC prosecutor in this case and in relation to Palestine could make a difference for journalists everywhere, because it is our view that if Israeli officials are prosecuted in an international tribunal for targeting journalists, it will be a deterrent for journalists for governments everywhere, and is sending a signal to their government, to governments everywhere and their officials, that these crimes will be taken seriously, there will be repercussions, and journalists who are covering the conflict are not fair game. So thank you very much for listening. I salute you all for your work. It's an absolute privilege to work with the IFJ, and I look forward to participating in the discussion.
Thanks so much, Jen, and thank you to you for all the work that you've done on not just the 3 cases that we've mentioned here, Palestine, the BBC Persian Service, and Julian Assange, but more widely in support of media freedom with other clients that I know you work with. Thank you to the 3 panelists who've made presentations. Our 4th panelist, Dominique, I've seen in the chat, but she's had problems being able to connect so that she can make a presentation. She was going to talk about the fight that the French unions are waging in relation to the misuse of Pegasus spyware, and I think it would be a good subject on which we could have a whole meeting. We did a panel at World Press Freedom Day around it, and maybe I can talk to Michelle about having a wider discussion on Pegasus and spyware and the surveillance of journalists, at which Dominique can participate. I've noticed a couple of questions, in fact 3, 4, yes, there's a few questions coming in now. Let me just read all of them, and you choose, given that we only have 10 minutes, which bits you want to respond to. So from Natasha Hurst, are there ways to increase the awareness of the wider public about the targeting of journalists, and would more attention and pressure from other countries make a difference to governments who do target journalists in this appalling way? From Francis Rafferty, how can NUJ branches get involved in the IFJ's campaigns to support Yemeni journalists and lobby the UK government to take up violations to press freedom? What difference does the solidarity and support of sister journalist unions internationally make to your members? And there was one earlier one which I'm just trying to find here. So what is the NUJ Ukraine saying and doing about Ukrainian government persecution of journalists, including Ukrainian journalists forced to leave because of threats against their life from nationalist forces? What does it say about extensive first-hand recorded evidence that the population in Mariupol was being used as a shield by Ukrainian forces? And does the NUJ Ukraine believe that Ukraine forces have not been involved in any war crimes? So how to get involved in campaigns? Does solidarity make a difference? How can we raise the profile of targeted attacks on journalists? And the question on Ukraine, I see several extra questions. What pressure can we put on national governments and the EU? And I don't think I have time to ask any other question. So let me go slightly in reverse order then, and talk to Jen first about what more can be done to raise the profile of the targeting of journalists, and what kind of pressure can we put on national and other bodies like the EU to make this a priority issue?
Well, the first thing to say, Jeremy, thanks for the question, is the role of unions is essential in our international advocacy. And so it really does help when we have different national unions raising with their governments, asking them to raise issues, showing solidarity with their colleagues around the world. Because in terms of our international advocacy that we do together with the IFJ, it involves us briefing governments, asking them to raise this issue in the context of the Human Rights Council, at the European Parliament, within the Council of Europe. And it matters to have domestic pressure. That domestic pressure can be brought by your unions raising these cases for us and asking your governments to do more. That helps our international advocacy. But of course, more media coverage of these issues is essential to raise awareness publicly and to allow us to put more pressure on governments. Adverse publicity and raising these issues in international fora does work. And we know it works. And one example that I use, which I think is counterintuitive, is about Iran, because Iran is probably the most intransigent state in the world, or one of them, along with North Korea. And people say, well, what does it matter that you're doing this advocacy at the UN? You know, do they care? Actually, they do care. And it does make a difference, because after our UN advocacy, working together with Jeremy and the IFJ, supported by the NUJ, Iran stopped hassling journalist family members in Iran quite as often. So we weren't seeing the same number of harassment incidents, arbitrary arrest and detention of family members. And that made a huge difference to NUJ members and to the BBC journalists who were affected. Another great example that I use about the importance of UN involvement and advocacy is, if we're talking about Yemen, since the Human Rights Council refused to vote to continue the independent experts' oversight of the conflict in Yemen, civilian casualties have doubled. And so what does that tell you? It's a very sad fact, an empirical fact, that shows that after the UN stopped paying attention, more civilian casualties take place. So I think help using the collective power of unions to put pressure on governments absolutely helps and works. So thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Jen, for that. And Sami, I'm sure that you would agree that more media coverage of the war in Yemen would be of great assistance. But alongside that, is there other things like the pressure on national governments and the EU? How can that help?
I would suggest that we need some pressure that should be imposed on the Houthi government, Houthi militias, by the UN and any other countries that has relation or respect or kind of relations with Houthis, because the Houthi militias consider the journalists as enemies, and when they capture the journalists, they trade them as fighters, and they want to exchange them and swap them in prisoner exchange deal, like they were fighter. They were captured from on field, while the Houthis just they go take the journalists from their own homes or from streets or during the, I mean, traveling from city to city. So we need the Houthis not, I mean, to stop considering the journalists in Yemen as enemies. This could be happen by pressure from the UN, and especially the UN, because it has a link with the Houthis when negotiating, and it should be like a priority to in this I mean file. Yeah.
And I want to give the final word to Lena in Ukraine. What kind of there's the direct question about Ukraine, but also what kind of how does international solidarity from sister unions assist your members, and how important is it?
Thank you, dear colleagues. Our international solidarity is extremely important for our members, because it helps to say at first to save lives of Ukrainian journalists. It helps to evacuated journalists. It helps them to settle the work in the new place and get new equipment and get the emergency support. On the other hand, we help our foreign colleagues to cover the situation in Ukraine and to help with interview and with trips to Ukraine and such other. I saw the question about the situation with in Mariupol, and about the situation with Ukrainian journalists who left the country. We have been maintaining the index of physical safety of journalists of Ukraine since 2017, and we record all cases of attacks against journalists, regardless of who the attacker was or what political force he belonged to. It's no matter the political views of journalists, but it's important if the attack was related to journalism. Regarding the situation in Mariupol, and you can see you can read the question in the chat from Richard. I would like to answer the question. I was born and worked until 2014 in Donetsk. Donetsk region is, Mariupol is 70 miles from Donetsk, and it's my home region, and I worked for many years there, and believe me, I also have first-hand information. Russia invasion, Russia hybrid war in Donbass forced me to leave my home 8 years ago, and now Russia invasion forced me to leave my new home the second time in my life. We have the testimony of 80 evacuated journalists from Mariupol who were assisted by our union, by support of International Federation and European Federation of Journalists. Civilians have become a living shield, not for the Ukrainian military. The Ukrainian military who remains in Mariupol doesn't have aircraft or a strategic bomber that use the 1 kiloton bombs to maternity hospital or to the theater or other peaceful facilities. The main problem is the Russia invasion. The Mariupol was a big and peaceful city until 24th of February. And it's quite a narrative of Russian propaganda to say that the people were like to be released by Russia army. If they are luck, why, for example, Ukrainian journalists can work in Mariupol now, and why, for example, I can't go to my home to Donetsk without risk to be arrested as a Ukrainian journalist. So it's my question to, it's my answer to this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. I think the point you make about the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine documenting all the attacks that there are on people carrying out their journalistic work is important, because I think for the International Federation of Journalists, from Ukraine to Palestine to Yemen, wherever journalists are under fire, our job is to be there and standing alongside them and supporting them. And so just in closing this webinar, can I remind you all about the letter, the open letter on Yemen that was in the chat and can be found on the IFJ website? Can I remind you about the Solidarity Fund for Ukrainian journalists? And can I remind you about raising the profile of the targeting of Palestinian journalists to help support the ICC case and other governments taking up that issue? And can I thank Lena, Jen and Sami for their comments, and thank all of you for joining today's webinar. And I hope that we'll be able to organise others in subsequent weeks and months on other issues and come back to these issues as and when needed. So thank you to Michelle and the team at the NUJ, and thank you to all of you, and have a good afternoon.